Can you hear me?
Yes po, Doc.
All right. So we'll begin. How many are you supposed to be? Or anyway, um, we'll begin our lecture on diseases of the small and large intestines. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Gentry D from the section of gastroenterology. So the objectives of today's presentation is to discuss common diseases of the small and large intestines. And for each disease, we'll briefly go through epidemiology, pathophysiology, the signs and symptoms, and diagnostic workups. Okay, so for the different disorders that we'll be discussing, we'll be tackling on disorders of absorption and specific diseases like inflammatory bowel syndrome, or inflammatory bowel disease, sorry, irritable bowel syndrome, and diverticular disease, and some common anorectal disorders, as well as mesenteric vascular insufficiency. We'll briefly go through malignancy, okay, and a little bit on ill use and intestinal obstruction. Okay. Hopefully, we'll be finished in 1 to 1.5 hours. Okay. Now, this is just a summary of what you should be reading in your textbook. So this should not replace you reading the textbook. Okay, so you should read your textbooks. Okay, so let's go on with the disorders of absorption. With disorders of absorption, we have to know how absorption happens. No? So there are phases of absorption. And the first phase is the luminal digestion. The second is the small intestinal mucosal digestion and absorption. And finally, post-mucosal absorption. Now, anything that would affect this phase will have consequences as far as absorption is concerned. When we talk of luminal digestion, we talk of digestion that occurs in the mouth, in the stomach, that involves lipase, pepsin, pancreatic enzymes, and bile. When we talk of small intestinal mucosal digestion and absorption, we talk of those mediated by enterocyte brush border enzymes like disaccharidases, enterokinase, and peptidases. Okay? And when we talk of post-mucosal absorption, we talk of those that is affected by the entry to the lymphatics and bloodstream. So, as you can see here, these are tables generated from Harrison. Okay, there may be inadequate digestion, particularly in the cases of post-gastrectomy. You might have deficiencies in inactivation of pancreatic lipase. Okay? You might have gastrinoma or um, um, increased acidity causing inactivation of lipase. You have drugs, you have liver disease, bacterial overgrowth. Okay, you might have interruption of enterohepatic circulation of bile salts. Okay, and some other drugs as well. Okay, we'll discuss some of them later. As far as mucosal loss, remember the second phase, okay? You might have intestinal resection or bypass, in some inflammatory or infection, okay? That would cause problems in the second phase of digestions, the genetic disorders, and impaired nutrient delivery to and from the intestines, okay? You might have lymphatic obstructions. And if you look here in this area, you will also have to consider non-intestinal disorders that will affect absorption. Okay? Congestive heart failure, constrictive pericarditis, okay? Mesenteric artery atherosclerosis, vasculitis. Okay? Also, consider endocrine and metabolic disorders as it affects absorption. Okay? For example, in patients with hyperthyroidism, you should have known this in your second year, that in patients with hyperthyroidism, absorption is impaired because of increased metabolic activity. Okay, so patients will have diarrhea, and this will lessen the chance of the intestines absorbing the nutrients necessary for a patient. Now, let's first discuss luminal bile acid deficiency. Okay, in here you can see on the left, okay, are some processes that will affect the availability of bile acid in the small intestinal lumen. Okay, so if there's a problem in synthesis that is seen in patients with cirrhosis, there will be decreased information of bile acid. There will be decreased biliary secretions when there is altered canalicular function seen in primary biliary cirrhosis. Okay, and some other problems. Crohn's disease will result to abnormal ileal function and therefore affecting reabsorption. Okay, so what happens in these patients, okay, is that because of deficiency of bile acid, there is alteration of absorption, particularly of fats. Okay, of course, alteration also of other nutrients may be seen with bile acid deficiency. Okay? So what does these patients experience? Okay? Patients with bile acid deficiency most commonly will present with diarrhea. Some may even have steatorrhea. Okay? So we have to consider also that there will be nutrient malabsorption. Okay, and we have to be cognizant of which nutrients, okay, are not absorbed properly with bile acid deficiencies. Because if we are able to recognize which nutrients are not being absorbed properly, then we might be able to find out what is wrong with the patient. Okay. So if in this case, if the problem is because if the diarrhea and the nutrient malabsorption is because of bile acid deficiency, then treatment would require us to give bile acid sequestrants. Okay, so that bile acid will be available to be used for absorption. Now, another in another situation, okay, a patient might have bacterial overgrowth. Okay? We all know that the intestines contains a rich microbiome, okay, and that alteration of this microbiome, okay, when there is overgrowth, okay, particularly overgrowth, this causes bile acid absorption in the proximal bowel, leading to luminal bile acid deficiency to the rest of the small intestine. Okay, and so because of lack of bile acid, there will be a problem with absorption, particularly of fats. There may be carbohydrate maldigestion, vitamin B12 deficiencies. What would cause then small bowel bacterial overgrowth? In disorders that will affect motility or stasis or disorders that cause stasis of bowel contents may lead to small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or sometimes shortly called SIBO. Okay, so if there's a stasis of bowel contents, then that promotes bacterial overgrowth. Instances like scleroderma, chronic intestinal pseudo-obstruction, okay, the creation of bile surgical loops, Billroth-2 anastomosis, and several other disorders, including inflammatory disorders, can cause small intestinal bowel overgrowth. Okay, so how then do we diagnose these patients? We are presented with the patient with diarrhea, with steatorrhea, with some evidences of carbohydrate or vitamin B12 deficiencies. You do a duodenal aspiration and check for bacterial titers. Okay, if the bacterial titers is elevated, then you have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Okay? Now, how do we go about treatment for these patients? We have to find out what caused it. Remember, we mentioned about some problems, some anatomical trouble, the overproduction or bacterial overcause. We can use some and if we are forced to use antibiotics, we have to use rotating antibiotics, meaning we don't use one specific antibiotics at a time, all the time. Okay. As far as intestinal mucosal disorders are concerned, okay, there are disorders that may affect only the carbohydrate transporters or specific enzyme deficiencies. Most commonly is lactase deficiency, causing lactose intolerance. Okay? In here, we note that there is disaccharidase deficiency in the brush border of the small intestine. Okay, and because of this, lactose is not digested, and we know that it can cause some form of osmotic diarrhea. Okay, there will be abdominal pain, gassiness, and bloating. Okay? So, how do we go about this? Okay, first, again, we have to know how to diagnose. Okay, get a good history and PE, find out if the patient's symptoms will only occur when there's intake of lactose. Okay? And if patients do not take lactose or has decreased lactose intake, whether these patients will have also those symptoms, okay, then that might be a clue already for lactase deficiency. Of course, we can give always a challenge, lactose tolerance, or check also for breath hydrogen test, okay, to see whether by giving lactose, whether it will trigger the symptoms. Okay, so if we are sure that um, lactose, there is lactose intolerance, then we can give lactase supplementation. Okay, of course, we limit the intake of lactose in the diet. Okay, that is to prevent more GI losses, more abdominal pain, and gassiness. Now, another mucosal disorder, intestinal mucosal disorder that might affect or that might cause several nutrient deficiencies, and not only uh, a specific nutrient. Okay, okay, is a celiac disease. This is not really common in our setting. Okay, but we might have patients who might have these kinds of problems. Okay, gluten, another term is gluten sensitive enteropathy or celiac sprue. Okay, this results from the immune response to gluten or to antibodies to tissue transglutaminase affects the small intestines, causing villus atrophy. Okay, so you will have some form of malabsorption, okay, and lactose intolerance as well. Okay, there will be crypt hyperplasia and fluid hypersecretion. Okay, so for mild cases, patients might be asymptomatic. Okay, but for more severe cases, patients will have diarrhea, weight loss, growth failure, migraine, headaches, ataxia, osteoporosis, iron deficiency anemia. Again, related to depends on what nutrient um, is involved and that you will know which how to approach this patient. Okay, so the diagnosis is to try to get a positive antibody level. Unfortunately, I do not know if we do have this in the Philippines. Okay, what we can do is do a small intestinal biopsy, get a sample of the mucosa of the small intestine, okay, and see if there's the characteristic villus blunting, crypt hyperplasia, villus atrophy, okay, and see if also there's an increased intraepithelial um, lymphocytes. Okay, so there is a severity criteria for this, but treatment, unfortunately, generally is just to provide um, gluten-free diet. Okay, so you can search the internet for a list of foods which are uh, gluten-free, so that we can advise these patients what to take. Okay, now there are other intestinal mucosal disorders. Okay, we have the celiac gluten sensitivity disorder. Then we also have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Okay, so the small intestine biopsy is normal, and yet these patients may be sensitive to gluten. Okay, so treatment remains the same as celiac. You give them a gluten free diet. Okay, and then um, much less common are Whipple's disease and tropical sprue in our setting. Okay, right. Another form of mucosal disorder is the short bowel syndrome. Okay, pretty much self-explanatory. Okay, you have a small intestine that has been reduced, okay, significantly, and therefore does not have cannot sustain the normal absorption that is required by the body. Okay, so generally, in patients where the small intestine, that where the remaining small intestine is less than 200 centimeters, you expect these patients to have short bowel syndrome. Okay, or um, particularly in more severe conditions where there's less than 100 centimeters of the small intestine left and the large intestine is also affected and therefore removed, then you have a tendency to develop intestinal failure. Okay, whatever you give to the patient will just um, eliminate them without any form of absorption. Okay, so these patients would require lifetime total parenteral nutrition. Okay, so for patients who still have some form of remaining small bowel, okay, you expect that there will be severe malabsorption because of the diarrhea. So control the diarrhea by giving antispasmodic, antidiarrheal agents, okay, and then um, be conscious of the electrolytes of these patients, okay, because these are the major things that will happen in patients with short bowel syndrome. Okay, so we have discussed luminal, we have discussed intestinal mucosal disorder. Now is the phase where it affects the post mucosal absorption. Okay, and there is primary disorder of the intestinal lymphatics. Okay, and there is secondary disorder. Okay? Now, ordinarily, following absorption by the small intestine, okay, the nutrients are further processed and transported into the lymphatics before it is circulated into the portal circulation and eventually to the other parts of the body. Anything that will affect this process of transportation into the lymphatics will cause malabsorption. Okay, so intestinal lymphangiectasia, or there's some form of blockage into by the lymphatics in the form of retroperitoneal fibrosis, fibrosing mesenteries, or lymphoma, okay, can cause these problems. Okay? Again, there are uh, uh, extraintestinal causes that can cause malabsorption. Okay, so um, congestive heart failure, constrictive pericarditis. Okay, another form of postmucosal um, uh, absorb malabsorption, okay, is the protein losing enteropathy. Okay, so in here, patients will have hypoproteinemia, edema, okay, generalized edema, but take note that there should be absence of liver disease, okay, or kidney disease with proteinuria. Okay, of course, patients' intake should also be adequate. No? So hindi pwede yung protein calorie malnutrition. Okay, kwashiorkor and marasmus, hindi pwede. Okay, this should be due to excess protein losses in the GI tract. Okay, so there's exudation of proteins caused by mucosal ulceration. Okay, there might be exudation of proteins due to non-ulcerative uh, uh, non-ulcerated mucosa, but with evidence of loss of proteins because of altered permeability. You see that in Menetrier's disease, hypertrophic gastropathy, and also patients might have exudation of proteins in the GI tract with lymphatic dysfunction. Okay, so there's no blockage, okay, but there may be blockage, okay, because of an enlarged lymph node or cardiac disease causing protein exudation. Okay, so we diagnose this based on the history of diarrhea with steatorrhea. We will see peripheral edema. Okay, we ruled out the possibility of liver disease or a significant proteinuria. Okay, and when we check the blood for albumin and globulin, we find that both of them are decreased. Okay, if only the albumin is decreased and the globulin is not decreased, then we have to consider um, other things. Okay, so we have to work out for other possible causes of the decreased albumin. Okay, so for these patients, both the albumin and the globulin are decreased. Okay, we might do some other tests, measurement of alpha-1 antitrypsin. There might be a presence of lymphopenia. Okay, endoscopy, can do biopsies to be sure that there's no structural problems to explain this uh, disease. Okay. Okay. Of course, as we mentioned, we have to be sure that um, if the GI is not affected, then we have to find out if other extra intestinal source of the protein losing enteropathy is possible. Okay, so we give a low fat, high protein diet with medium chain triglycerides, and we treat the underlying cause. If we are able to find out what the primary cause of the problem is. Okay, so is there inflammatory bowel disease? Okay, that will cause mucosal ulceration and protein loss because of that. So we treat the ulcerative colitis. So generally, approach to a patient with malabsorption, we have to get a good history and PE. Okay, as in good history and PE, find out if there are specific types of malabsorption, is there a specific vitamin or specific protein or specific mineral that is not being digested properly, okay? And then work up from there, okay? So which means that we have to know which part of the small intestine is this nutrient being absorbed? Okay, is this being absorbed in the duodenum? Is this being absorbed in the jejunum? Is this being absorbed in the ileum? Okay. Is there any surgical alterations? Okay. Is there a disease that would cause these problems? Okay. We also check the stool osmolality. Okay. Is this a osmotic type of diarrhea? Is this a secretory type of diarrhea? Okay. Could this be from too much lactose? Okay. Or is this a intestinal issue that causes diarrhea, or a pancreatic insufficiency that would cause diarrhea? Okay. So we can also do radiographic tests. Okay. For small intestine, we want to find out if there is fistula, whether there are ulcerations affecting the small intestine that would make you suspect Crohn's disease. Okay. And finally, we mentioned a little while ago about endoscopy. Okay, with biopsy. Okay. Now, according to Harrison, these are some of the things that can be diagnosed with small intestinal mucosal biopsies. Okay, so lymphoma, you see the patchy-specific lymphoma, okay, eosinophilic gastroenteritis, Crohn's disease, infection, while for the diffuse, or we have celiac disease, okay, folate deficiency, vitamin B deficiency, okay. So there are these are things that can be diagnosed using biopsy of the small intestines with their pathologic findings to the right. Okay, we mentioned celiac disease, where there's alteration, venous atrophy, okay, lymphocytes, okay, then okay. We've discussed already disorders of absorption. Okay. Next, we go to specific disease entities. Okay. For now, in particular, is inflammatory bowel disease. Okay. This is a chronic idiopathic inflammation of the GI tract. Okay. Idiopathic. And there are two kinds: ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. There are differences between the two. Before, it was just a disease commonly seen in the West, but now it's becoming more common in the Asia Pacific region because of urbanization and westernization. There seems to be genetic predisposition, okay, and that there are environmental factors that would increase a patient's risk to have inflammatory bowel disease. Okay. As you can see here in the center, okay, this is the pathophysiology. We have alteration of the microbial flora. We have alteration of the epithelium, okay, and alteration of the immune system. Okay, anything that will affect all three, okay, can cause inflammatory bowel disease. Okay, so we go down here: enteropathogens, antibiotics, diet, hygiene, NSAIDs, smoking, stress. These are environmental factors that will alter these normal um, small intestinal or large intestinal homeostasis. Now, once that is altered, patients are prone to develop inflammatory bowel disease. Now, how do we, the next few slides will differentiate ulcerative colitis from Crohn's disease. Okay, so there's basically the same for age of onset, ethnicity. Okay, look at smoking. Smoking may prevent disease in ulcerative colitis, but it may cause disease in Crohn's disease. Okay, female patients using oral contraceptives are at a higher risk of developing Crohn's. Okay, you see that there's some genetic susceptibilities, okay, for twins, and that there is an increased risk of developing IBD if there are infections in the first year of life of the patient. Okay, now clinically, histologically, here are some of the differences or comparison between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Okay, so ulcerative colitis usually affects only the colon. Okay, and it continues, it can start from the rectum. Okay, now there may be some form of involvement of the small intestine, particularly for ulcerative colitis, but they would term that as backwash ileitis. Okay, for Crohn's disease, it can affect any part of the GI tract. Okay, so small intestine, okay, colon, but generally it is in the terminal ileum. Okay, the pattern of involvement for ulcerative colitis is continuous. Okay, so from the sigmoid, from the rectum, okay, up into the right side of the colon. Okay, in contrast to Crohn's disease, where there are skip lesions, meaning one part is affected. During colonoscopy, you see that there are ulcerations in one part, there's normal mucosa in the succeeding part, and another affected part further up the colon. This is what we call skip lesions. Another particular feature for ulcerative colitis is that it spares the anal area. Okay, compared to Crohn's disease, where you have perianal fistula, abscesses. Okay, okay. Okay. So rectal involvement is in UC, but often spared in Crohn's. Okay, the rectum. Okay, but the fistula is common in the perianal area in the small intestines for Crohn's disease. Okay, so sorry, rectal sparing okay, is in Crohn's disease. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay, so another feature, gross appearance, is the cobblestone. Because of the skip lesions, it will appear as cobblestones. Complications, you will see that Crohn's disease has fistulas and more malabsorption. Okay, so these are the things that you would have to watch out for, particularly in malabsorption. Crohn's disease may be implicated. Okay. Although in ulcerative colitis, you remove the colon, it's curative. In Crohn's disease, unfortunately, even after surgery, okay, it can recur. Okay, so how do we diagnose? So basically, both are the same, except when you do endoscopy, there you will see the differences, the skip lesions, the rectal sparing, the continuous inflammation, etc. Okay, and then when you do biopsies, okay, for ulcerative colitis, you have crypt abscesses, but there's no granulomas compared to Crohn's disease, okay, where there is transmural inflammation. Okay, for ulcerative colitis, it only affects the mucosa. Okay, that's why there is no fistula formation compared to Crohn's disease, where it affects the whole um, thickness of the intestine. Okay, so if it affects the whole thickness of the intestine, it becomes prone to develop fistula. Okay, and take a look at this in Crohn's disease. There is non-cacheating granulomas. Okay, does this sound familiar to us? Okay, cacheating granulomas. So if we find a patient with a lesion, a mass in the ileocecal area, okay, one of the differentials is tuberculosis. Okay, another differential is malignancy. Okay, so how do we differentiate TB from Crohn's disease? Histologically, non-cacheating granuloma. Then we do determination for MTB, gene expert, quantiferon, etc. It should be negative for Crohn's. Okay? Imaging, again, knowing the pattern of involvement of the intestine, okay? Continuous wall thickening, okay, lead pipe colon, compared to segmental thickening because of the skip lesions. Okay, so contrast studies, you see the skip areas there. Okay, of course, when you do enteroscopy, okay, there is uh, no lesion in the small intestine, particularly for ulcerative colitis, compared um, to Crohn's, where there will be ulcerations, strictures, okay, bleeding sites. Okay. What is important is because there is an association to develop malignancy is to get biopsies for ulcerative colitis, and for Crohn's disease is to continuously monitor disease extent. Okay. Unfortunately, you only can do that with radiologic studies. Okay, so in the form of um, small intestinal series, or CT scan, or MR enterography. Now, another thing that may cause concern for patients um, with inflammatory bowel disease is that there are extra intestinal areas that can be affected. Okay, so you will see this. Okay, so it doesn't mean that if patients will have uh, ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, then that's it. You have to look into the other problems, like dermatologically, there might be pyoderma gangrenosum, erythema nodosum being more common in Crohn's disease. Okay, so I'll go a bit faster now because I might not finish this lecture if I uh, uh, go slow. Okay. Diseases that mimic TB, we mentioned tuberculosis earlier. Okay. Because inflammatory bowel disease can present with diarrhea, can present with hematochezia, can present with mass, malabsorption, etc. Okay. So so these are the things that you should consider. Of course, non-infectious or non-inflammatory etiologies should also be considered. Okay, particularly neoplastic, because sometimes you see mass. Treatment, okay, generally for uh, is to make sure that there is proper hydration. Okay, the goal is to induce and maintain remission and um, prevent recurrence, prevent um, complications. That's for both. Okay, so steroids for mild to moderate severe disease, for to this is for acute uh, treatment. Okay, but for maintenance therapy, okay, uh, um, we have anti-inflammatory agents, biologics for ulcerative colitis, okay, and the same with Crohn's disease. Now, we will not really discuss this in detail, okay, because if you have a patient with inflammatory bowel disease, it's best that you refer them to a gastroenterologist. Okay, curative. Okay, as we mentioned earlier, for ulcerative colitis, it's curative, but for Crohn's disease, it's not curative and recurrence is common. Okay, so we have as much as possible high protein, high calorie diet for ulcerative colitis. Okay, for Crohn's disease, since this affects the small intestine and therefore we've discussed earlier the possibility of malabsorption, we still prefer enteral feeding, okay, over parenteral feeding. Okay. So for the induction phase, we mentioned corticosteroids, okay, or biologics to control active inflammation, and for the maintenance phase, immunomodulators or biologics to prevent relapse. Now, there's two school of thought in the treatment for inflammatory bowel disease, is whether to step up from a low dose or low less effective to a more effective high cost, which is step up, or top down. You start from the top, the most effective, then gradually release, lower the dose. Okay, so depends on you. There's no really hard and fast rule, but generally most of the physicians would prefer top down. We want to control them first, then titrate the dose down. So these are the indications for surgery, okay, for both ulcerative and Crohn's disease. Next is irritable bowel syndrome. No? So sometimes it gets confused with inflammatory bowel disease. So this is irritable bowel syndrome is a functional disorder characterized by abdominal pain, discomfort, altered bowel habits in the absence of detectable structural abnormalities. Now, this is relatively quite common, okay, 10 to 20% prevalence. And more often than not, there is an overlap with other functional disorder. Okay. Unfortunately, irritable bowel syndrome can be predominantly of the diarrhea type. Some might be on the constipation type. Okay. So this is a brief pathophysiology. Okay. There's motility abnormalities, there's gut dysbiosis, visceral hypersensitivity, there are psychological issues, there may be bile acid malabsorption, all leading to irritable bowel. How do we diagnose? Based on symptoms. Recurrent abdominal pain, at least 1 day per week for the past 3 months, associated with more than or equal to 2 of the following criteria. This is Rome 4 diagnostic criteria. Okay? It's related to defecation. Okay? Constipation or diarrhea. Associated with a change of frequency in stool. Increase, decrease. Diarrhea, constipation. Change in form. Hard to watery. Okay? So the criteria should be fulfilled for the last 3 months with symptom onset at least 6 months prior to diagnosis. Meaning you cannot diagnose a patient to have IBS on the first consultation when the patient presents with 1 month history of symptoms. Okay? So get a good history and physical exam. If this occurs in a patient who is elderly or there's a progressive course, persistent diarrhea, even when fasting, there is nocturnal diarrhea, steatorrhea, you have to investigate. Okay? These things does not point to a irritable bowel syndrome, progressive course. We have to make sure that this is just not something more serious. Okay? Check for alarm symptoms. Is there weight loss? Is there blood in the stool? Okay? Sometimes we have to do some tests. Okay? Sometimes in other patients, we have done several tests just to rule out other disease entities. Treatment, patient counseling, dietary alterations, try to see which diet triggers the symptoms. Are there any stress or anxiety in this patient? You give stool bulking agents, particularly for diarrheic patient. You give osmotic laxatives for patients who have IBS, predominantly constipated. Okay? Antispasmodics, antidiarrheal, antiflatulence. Okay? Sometimes you might give antidepressants as well. Okay? Procalopride is a serotonin receptor modulator that would promote motility. So this is for IBS constipation. Can give secretagogues. Okay? You can give probiotics, prebiotics, low FODMAP. Okay? Antibiotics, these are still not evidence-based. No? There's some conflicts, conflicting results, but it may be worth the try. So this is a FODMAP diet. Okay, so you might want to consider giving these types of diet prescription for the patients. Next is diverticular disorders. What are diverticular disorders? Diverticular disorders are um, outpouching of the normal wall, more normal lining, whether it's the intestine, large intestine, the stomach, the esophagus, or the duodenum. Okay, you see that there is a outpouching there, outpouching here, there, and there. Okay. In the small intestine, what is um, um, relatively of note is the Meckel's diverticulum. Here there is a failure of the vitelline duct to resorb completely. Okay, and this is a congenital anomaly that occurs in 2 to 3% of the general population. It's located within 100 centimeters of the ileocecal valve. Okay, and this contains gastric, most commonly gastric tissues, but it may contain pancreatic, colonic, or hepatobiliary tissue, some Brunner's glands, okay, and because it might contain gastric mucosa, then Helicobacter pylori may also be seen in the Meckel's diverticle. Okay, so why are we talking about Meckel's diverticle? Because Meckel's diverticle can cause bleeding. Usually, this is in pediatrics, but we've seen this in young adults, okay, 20s. Okay, so um, uh, hematochezia is not really common in patients in their 20s or early 30s. So if that happens, we have to um, consider Meckel's diverticulum. Okay, so Meckel's can also present with intussusception, volvulus, inflammation, or scarring. So how do we diagnose a patient to have Meckel's diverticle? You do a nuclear imaging. Okay, the nuclear imaging will detect the presence of ectopic gastric mucosa. Remember, we mentioned earlier that Meckel's diverticle may contain gastric mucosa. It's the most common. So, false positive and false negative results can happen. Okay? False negative because other ectopic mucosa can be present, causing the Meckel's diverticle. Okay? So, you have to have a high level of suspicion if the Meckel's divertical, if the radio-labeled technetium scanning is negative, then you can do angiography or enteroclysis, okay, to document the divertical. Okay. treatment is surgical. Remove that part of the small intestine. Okay. Now, in the large intestine, okay, so these are, we mentioned earlier, sac outpouching or sac-like herniation of the bowel wall. In the large intestine, this affects 1/3 of the population, particularly those more than 60 years old. Excuse me. Now, 10 to 25% of them will have acute diverticular disease, meaning there will be symptoms. Okay, we'll discuss that later. What symptoms? 10 to 25% of those will have recurrent symptoms, and 10% requires surgery. Commonly, it's found in the left side, the sigmoid descending colon, but in Asians, more and more have been found on the right side, 70%. Okay, they may be a true or false or pseudo diverticula. So clinical presentation includes hemorrhage, bleeding. This is the most common cause of bleeding, particularly in patients more than 60 years old. Okay, but only 20% of diverticals bleed. Remember earlier, 10 to 25% will have acute diverticular symptoms, and bleeding is the most common cause. Okay. Usually, these patients are hypertensive. They may be on antithrombotic therapy. Okay, so and some of them have NSAID use, obese, diabetes mellitus. Okay, so it is important for a patient with lower GI bleeding to identify the source of the bleeding. How do we do that? Whether we do a colonoscopy, CT angiogram, okay. If colonoscopy does not is not able to identify it, then you can do CT angiogram, you can do RBC tagging to help you help us in the diagnosis of where the bleeding is coming from. If stable, okay, percutaneous mesenteric angio with coiling is the preferred method, or colonoscopy with banding of divertical if the bleeding site is identified. If unstable, massive GI bleeding, elderly, if unstable, or a patient is receiving already more than 6 units of blood in the past 24 hours, or there is failed medical therapy, then surgery is warranted. Okay. Now, patients usually with bleeding diverticals, usually they will stop bleeding within 48 to 72 hours. So if the bleeding is not that much, then generally they will stop on its own. Okay? So what happens? What scenarios? Like for example, you're initially presented with a patient with lower GI bleeding. We do a colonoscopy, we find diverticals, but no active bleeding anymore. Okay? And then patient comes back again a few months later, again with the same presentation. Okay? Maybe you opted not to do a colonoscopy because you know that the bleeding will stop on its own. That is an option. You can wait it out 48 hours, 72 hours. Okay? If it's mild, then you can just wait it out. Okay? Give transfusion if necessary. Another presentation of patients with diverticals is the diverticals are inflamed or infected. Okay? And this can be documented with the use of CT scan. There's a presence of diverticle, which is very important before we can say that there's diverticulitis. Okay? The walls of that segment of the intestine is more than 4 millimeters with pericolic fat or stranding with or without fluid collection. Okay, so these patients will present with abdominal pain, okay, fever, leukocytosis, okay, some form of obstipation. Okay, this is for uncomplicated diverticular disease. Okay, colonoscopy. We prefer not to do immediate colonoscopy in patients with diverticulitis for fear that it might cause perforation of the large intestine. But if it's necessary, then we just need to be careful on how to do it. Okay? We also have to do colonoscopy to make sure that there is no malignancy in the patient. So how do we diagnose a patient with diverticulitis? Is the CT scan, but we also have to classify it, no, using this Hinchey classification. Okay, so phlegmon, presence of phlegmon or pericolic abscess. Is there a distant abscess already? Is there a peritonitis but non-communicating perforation, or is there communicating perforation already with fecal peritonitis, meaning the stools are already inside the peritoneum compared to stage 3. Okay, so this is very important, particularly as far as treatment is concerned. Okay, so for asymptomatic diverticles found um, on 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 checkup or found for some other reasons, then we do not do anything. Lifestyle change, meaning increase fluid intake, avoid constipation, avoid straining, etc. Okay, for symptomatic disease, usually we do bowel rest. Once diet is allowed, then we give fiber supplementation. We ask patients to stop smoking and to reduce weight. Now, for those with uncomplicated diverticular uh, disease that are symptomatic, so that's what we call SUDD, symptomatic uncomplicated diverticular disease. Okay, no antibiotics is needed. No antibiotics is needed. Okay, but some are concerned with prevention. Okay, so some have tried giving mesalazine, rifaximin, or some uh, probiotics. Now, the risk of recurrence is higher in younger individuals, okay, or those that have formation of abscess, or those who have more than 2 times attacks per year. Okay, now treatment for those with phlegmon, abscess, okay, is antibiotics. Okay, for distant, you can do aspiration and drainage of abscess. For the local abscess, if it's less than 3 centimeters of abscess, then we generally can perhaps observe. Okay, but if the abscess is more than 3 centimeters, sometimes others would say 5 centimeters, but if it's more than 3 centimeters, then you do abscess drainage. Okay, surgery is needed, particularly for those with peritonitis already. Okay, this is to control sepsis, eliminate complications, remove diseased colon, and restore intestinal continuity. In practice, we do not really immediately advise surgery, particularly for those with localized abscess. No? But it is recommended. Okay, so here you see that it's the recommendation, of course, antibiotics, drainage, okay, initially for 1B pericolic abscess followed by resection. But for 2 to 4, Inchi classification 2 to 4, surgery. Okay. Going down the large intestine, we have rectal prolapse, where the rectum protrudes out of the anal orifice, as you can see here. Okay, not this, where it's only part of the rectum that goes out. It should be the whole rectum, the full thickness of the rectum. And it's usually associated with redundant sigmoid, pelvic laxity, deep rectovaginal septum. Okay, so patients would say there's anal mass, there's bleeding, okay? They will have a poor perianal hygiene, okay? Initially, they may be reducible. That's why some patients will mistake this for hemorrhoids. But eventually, they may cause outlet obstruction, okay? Um, the there may be colonic inertia, there may be solitary rectal ulcer syndrome. Okay, so this patient should be evaluated for the presence of pelvic floor disorder. We also have to rule out malignancy. Okay, so in anismus, there is non-relaxing puborectalis. Okay, because there is failure of straightening of the rectum during defecation. Okay, colonic inertia is documented by doing this test wherein there is retention, more than 20% retention of markers 5 days after ingestion of the markers. I do not know if we have this. No? Treatment, we can try fiber diet, okay? Lessen the inflammation, push back the prolapse, and make the stool softer so that it doesn't come out every time there's um, bowel movement. Okay, but the mainstay of therapy is surgical correction. Okay, whether transabdominal or transperineal. Note, however, that there's a lower recurrence rate for transabdominal approach, and there may be the transperineal approach may be reserved for those who have significant comorbidities. Fecal incontinence, as the term implies, there is involuntary passage of fecal materials for at least 1 month. Okay, so normally when we defecate, we are able to control, okay, ourselves from inappropriately defecating in other places, right? But sometimes, if there's involuntary passage, then there's a problem. This usually affects females more than 65 years old, and usually those who are multiparous. There is associated urinary incontinence in these patients, and fecal incontinence usually results from obstetric injury, where there is injury to muscle fibers, or there is stretching of the pudendal nerves, and therefore loss of control uh, of the anorectal muscles. So there's incontinence to flatus, there's seepage of liquid stools, eventually there's inability to control the passage of solid waste, and of course, poor perianal hygiene because you cannot control uh, yourself from your stools coming out, right? So generally, a rectal exam, rectal inspection will be enough to document these problems, okay? You may do anorectal manometry to document the weakness in the muscles, and if available, endoanal ultrasound prior to treatment. Treatment is to increase the bulk in the stool, make them more formed so that it's a little bit bigger, no? So that it does not easily pass out. Okay. Sphincteroplasty, a surgical technique, and sacral nerve stimulation may help. Hemorrhoidal disease, lots of people have this. Okay. Hemorrhoid, in a normal individual, there are vessels, okay, that serve as cushions. Okay, so they are called hemorrhoidal cushions. Now, when these are inflamed, they can prolapse into the anal canal. Okay, now there are um, three areas of hemorrhoidal cushions. Okay, the left lateral, the right anterior, and right posterior. Okay, any one of them can become inflamed, okay, and cause symptoms. When there's external thrombosis, becomes painful. Okay, the external hemorrhoids are covered by squamous epithelium. The internal hemorrhoids are covered with mucosa and transitional zone epithelium, and this is located above the dentate line. So you have to go back to your anatomy what the dentate line is. Okay. Usually they may present with bleeding, they may present with protrusion. Okay, so patients may have feeling of anal mass. Okay. So it is very important we rule out other causes of bleeding. Okay. Do our good history and PE. Okay. Do anoscopy to see the hemorrhoidal vessels, whether they're engorged, they're bleeding, etc. Again, we should differentiate from full thickness rectal prolapse. Okay. We mentioned that in rectal prolapse, it's the full thickness. Okay, so it's a circumferential thing compared to a one-sided or a radial nature of hemorrhoids. So there's also staging as far as hemorrhoids is concerned with their corresponding treatment. Now, the problem with hemorrhoids is that they can recur. So we rarely advise surgery already in these patients. Okay, so if you see here, stage 1, stage 2, okay, there's no surgery here. Stage 3, there's still some role for non-surgical, but if there's really bothersome symptoms, chronic symptoms of protrusion, then perhaps we can go for surgery. No? But for stage 4, irreducible protrusion, we do hemorrhoidectomy. or for patients with profuse persistent bleeding, no? We might offer surgery. For anorectal abscess, okay, there's a male to female ratio of 3:1. This is more common in males and usually found in the 3rd to 5th decade of life. Now, patients who are immunocompromised are more prone to develop um, are prone to develop anorectal abscess. These are infection. This results from infection from glands surrounding the anal canal when stools enter the glands. Okay, so um, um, location-wise, okay, majority of them are located perianally. Okay, some are located ischiorectal area, intersphincteric, and supralevator, as you can see in this diagram. Um, all right. So, of course, an abscess is painful. Sometimes they may have fever. Because of the pain, they would have difficulty um, in defecation. They may have difficulty in voiding. Okay? There may be blood in the stool. And on PE, this is enough already. PE, there's a fluctuant area. Okay? Tender fluctuant area. Okay? So what do we do? Generally, the best is to do um, um, incision and drainage. Okay? Uh, and we have to note that there is a risk for necrotizing fasciitis, particularly um, uh, in immunocompromised patient. Okay? Antibiotics has limited role, surprisingly. Okay? It has a limited role, except for patients who are immunocompromised, patients with prosthetic heart valves, artificial joints, diabetes, patients with diabetes, and patients diagnosed with inflammatory bowel disease. Okay? So, meaning that um, patients with presenting with this should immediately undergo incision and drainage and not to wait uh, longer. Okay? And unfortunately, in our setting, some patients do not seek consult immediately, and therefore, we need to give them antibiotics. Okay? So, the next is a relatively common um, complaint also of some patients is that there is a communication of an abscess cavity with an unidentifiable internal opening within the anal canal. So patients uh, perhaps had the abscess before, and now because of that abscess, um, it communicates into a fistula into another part of the skin or of the colon. Okay. Uh, Usually, as I said, they develop after abscesses, but they can also develop in patients with inflammatory bowel disease. Remember, perianal abscess and fistula in patients with Crohn's disease. Okay, tuberculosis, malignancy, radiation. Okay, and these are the different areas where they can be located. Okay, compared to the location of perianal abscess. Okay, so patients would have constant drainage, okay, with firm mass. Drainage may increase with defecation, okay, so may discharge. Okay, they have discharge even without bowel movement. They will have discharge. Okay. Anoscopy to look for internal opening. This is easier said than than found. Okay, because these are small openings. Sometimes, in a lot of instances, you will fail to notice it. Okay. But generally, treatment is surgical. You cut open the fistula. Okay. Medically, you give stool bulking agents so that the stool does not cause further inflammation and abscess. Okay. Of course, we watch out for urinary retention and bleeding. The risk of recurrence is high because of the possibility of recurrent perianal abscesses. So, anal fissure, there is injury to the anal canal, usually as a result of trauma. And of course, because there is injury, there will be pain, there will be bleeding. The posterior anal canal is most commonly affected than the anterior canal. But if the area of the fissure is not in the posterior and anterior canal, then you have to consider other disease entities, TB, syphilis, Crohn's, malignancy. Okay. In here, there is poor healing because of relative ischemia due to the increased anal sphincter tone. Okay, so it is a bit difficult to treat these patients, or treating these patients may take a longer time. Okay, so you get a good history in PE. Make sure that there's no hemorrhoids that causes the pain, okay, or the bleeding. Okay, make sure that there is no other symptoms, no other cause of the bleeding. Okay, if there's none, then treatment for anal fissure is conservative. Okay, some have tried giving nifedipine ointment or injecting botulinum to relax the anal sphincter. Going down to mesenteric vascular ischemia or intestinal ischemia. This occurs when the splanchnic perfusion fails to meet the metabolic demands of the intestines. So if there's no perfusion, the intestines become ischemic, they may uh, uh, die. They may necrose, they may become gangrenous. Okay, there are risk factors. There's increased incidence in the aging population, and mortality is high at 50 to 80%, which makes it imperative, okay, that if presenting with these patients, there is a high index of suspicion, then we should be aggressive in diagnosing these patients and finding out whether there is really intestinal ischemia. Okay, Classification is chronic or acute mesenteric ischemia. Okay, so we know acute mesenteric ischemia, sudden interruption of intestinal blood flow causing ischemia or infarction. For chronic ischemia, this is long-standing, causing postprandial hypoperfusion. Acute mesenteric ischemia is a surgical emergency. Okay, so the etiology can be either there's an embolism, there's thrombosis, some might have non-occlusive low flow, or there's venous thrombosis. For chronic mesenteric ischemia, it's usually atherosclerosis. So if you have a patient who is has atrial fibrillation or who has myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, hypotensive on or in vasopressors, suddenly complaining of severe abdominal pain. And when you do your physical examination, okay, when you press the abdomen, it seems to be soft and non-tender, but the patient is complaining of severe pain, such that the pain is disproportionate to the findings. This is very crucial that you have to entertain mesenteric ischemia. Okay? There's increased WBC, there's increased lactate. Eventually, there will be metabolic acidosis. Okay? Prognosis, if delayed, causes high mortality. There will be necrosis, there will be gangrene of the intestine, there may be GI bleeding from the infected area. Okay? So if you are suspecting acute mesenteric ischemia, do the CT angio as soon as possible. Look for wall thickening, look for pneumatosis. Okay, there's no enhancement in the affected intestine compared to CT angio where there's in chronic mesenteric ischemia, usually these are postprandial pain, okay, there's weight loss, gradual onset, benign abdomen, okay. CT angio will show stenosis of more than 2 mesenteric vessels. Okay, you can do angiography, but surgery, revascularization is very important. Okay, so whether earlier I said it's a surgical emergency because usually we catch them too late. Okay, so bowel resection is necessary, but if we catch them early, okay, then we can still revascularize. Okay, then prognosis becomes better. Okay, so there are also non-occlusive mesenteric ischemia without these are patients without vascular obstruction, and this is usually due to vasospasm and hypoperfusion. Okay, so patients are critically ill on vasoconstrictors, dialysis. Okay, so these are 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 risk factors for acute mesenteric ischemia also. Okay, compared to mesenteric venous thrombosis, okay, there are thrombotic vessels, hypercoagulable state. Okay, uh, the pain is dull, persistent, and may precede GI bleeding. There may be fever, bloating, nausea, vomiting. Okay, so Again, for non-occlusive, there's high mortality because of the underlying conditions. Okay, but for mesenteric venous thrombosis, okay, we can if diagnosed early, okay, and treated early with anticoagulation, okay, and treat cause of the thrombosis, then prognosis is good. Okay. The goal for non-occlusive mesenteric ischemia is to restore perfusion compared to venous thrombosis is to restore venous outflow and anticoagulate. Okay, here's another table giving us an overview of how to diagnose and how to treat, okay, the specific conditions for acute mesenteric ischemia. Okay, so you see anticoagulation, anticoagulation. Non-occlusive, no anticoagulation because it's not due to specific structural obstruction. Okay, let's briefly go through malignancy, just a few more slides. Okay. Malignancy has been discussed. Colorectal cancer has been discussed in your oncology. No? What I will be discussing or emphasizing right now is the screening for colorectal cancer. Okay, and this includes a digital rectal exam, tests for occult blood. Okay, fecal DNA is not yet readily available. Okay, imaging, contrast barium enema, or virtual colonoscopy endoscopic procedure like sigmoidoscopy and colonoscopy are screening strategies for colon cancer. All this is to detect patients' risk for colon cancer, okay, occult blood, etc. So to the left is a picture of a barium enema. You will see an apple core deformity. There's stricture here. There's a normal segment of the intestine here, another normal segment of the intestine with narrowing here. Okay. In here, there is a visual representation of polyps, okay, affecting the mucosa going larger, okay, precancerous polyps affecting deeper into the layer, okay, and adenocarcinoma affecting already the beyond the muscularis propria. Okay, adenocarcinoma. Here is just the submucosa affecting the submucosa. Okay, this layer is the muscularis propria. Invasive cancer goes beyond your serosa. Okay, so screening, okay, for average risk. You can start screening at 45 years old. Before it was just 50 to 75. There's a strong recommendation. The evidence is good. Okay. They are lowering the screening now to 45. Okay. For certain individuals, and the evidence is still not that good. Okay. So the guidelines would recommend stopping screening at the age of 75. But it is conditional, meaning if your patient is a strong 75, that you expect this patient to live for another 5, 10 years, okay, then go ahead and screen. Okay, but if your patient 75 years old, asymptomatic, bedridden, malnourished, then there's no actually no very much additional benefit of doing a screening procedure. Okay, remember, screening is for those who do not have symptoms. It's different if the patient has bleeding. Okay, that's different. That's not screening anymore. Okay, these are asymptomatic patients and they just reach this certain age. However, for those patients with first-degree relatives with colon cancer or advanced polyps, then start screening them 40 years old or 10 years before the age of the youngest relative at the time of diagnosis. Meaning, if a patient was diagnosed to have advanced polyp or colon cancer at the age of 55, okay, the first-degree relative, the sons, the daughters, should start screening at 40 years old. Okay? However, if the patient at the time of diagnosis was, for example, 45 years old, okay? So 10 years younger, 35. So first degree relatives should be screened at the age of 35 or 10 years before the age the patient was diagnosed. Okay? So, this is a common problem among inpatients, ileus, or intestinal obstruction. Yes, whichever yung earliest for the screening. Okay? That's correct. Okay? 40 years old if the age of the first patient was more than 50 years old. 40 years old is okay. But if the patient is younger than 50 years old at the time of diagnosis of cancer, then 10 years before that. Okay? Hindi 40 years old pa rin. 10 years younger. 10 years before that age. Okay? So if the patient has advanced polyp at the age of 35, then the first degree relative should be screened at the age of 25. Okay? Pag 50 and above, okay na yung 40. Pag 50 below, 10 years before. Okay? All right. So, ileus or intestinal obstruction, these patients will have abdominal distension, they may have vomiting, they may have pains, inability to tolerate feeding. Okay, when these patients are on nasogastric tube, they will have residual from previous feeding. Okay, so you have to document whether this is plain ileus or intestinal obstruction. Ileus is inability of the intestine to have a normal peristaltic movement, normal passage of food, normal passage of stool. Okay, and these are the common causes of ileus. Okay, after an intra-abdominal procedure, okay, electrolyte abnormalities, anesthetic agents, of course, if there's intestinal ischemia, abdominal inflammation, hemorrhage, and take note, non-abdominal causes like pneumonia, sepsis, hyperparathyroidism can also cause ileus. Now, this results from inflammatory processes, okay, increase in cytokines, etc., causing affecting the nerves and causing decreased motility. Okay. Now, on the other hand, intestinal obstruction, okay, most common, particularly for patients who have had surgery, whether recently or decades ago, is still adhesions. Okay, you have to be sure that there is no neoplasms, okay, or inflammatory bowel diseases. Okay, So, by and large, acute intestinal or colonic obstructions, more than 50% of them are post-operative in nature. Okay? Again, remember, adhesions does not occur only in recent surgery. It can occur in surgeries done years or decades ago. Okay? So how do we diagnose these patients? Okay. How can we differentiate these patients is to serially monitor these patients. We do x-rays of the abdomen. We check for air fluid levels. Okay. We check for abdominal distension of the intestines. Okay. We can do CT scan, check if there is a structural cause for the problem. Is there a stricture that would cause the obstruction? Okay. We check the electrolytes, particularly if it's ileus. Okay. Now, if it's ileus, we just wait it out. 3 to 5 days, generally they would be better. But if they do not improve, then we have to consider other complications or other disease entities that has complicated the ileus. Okay. Now, for intestinal obstruction, definitely we have to treat the underlying cause. If it's completely obstructed, then surgery. Okay. We decompress, we give antibiotics to prevent bacterial translocation. Okay. Now, there are other rare small intestinal or large intestinal diseases. You will have to read them in your you have to read them in Harrison. The source of this is Harrison. Okay, I have added some slides as a summary from other sources, but generally these can be seen in Harrison. As a reminder, again, you have to read Harrison for these topics because I might get questions that was not discussed. Okay, with that, thank you very much. If you have any question, 21st edition. 21st edition. No? Okay, unfair kung 22nd edition na sa inyo. 21st edition pa lang. Okay, so thank you very much and good luck on your exam.
Thank you po, Doc.
Thank you po.
Thank you po, Doc.